Good afternoon. So we are going to be hearing from Lieutenant General Robert Schmidle today, Principal Deputy Director of, sorry, this is abbreviated, cost assessment, sorry, that's my eyesight. Cost assessment and program evaluation at the United States Marine Corps, and former Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command. And moderating will be Dr. Darren Hayes, Director of Cybersecurity at Pace University. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Here we go. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. All right. So it is an honor to be here. Again, thanks to Louise Blouin for allowing me to moderate this discussion here. I have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor for discussion. So first and foremost, Lieutenant General Schmidle, thank you for your service to our country and for helping protect our nation. I noticed from your impressive biography that you do have something in common with me. You do have a degree in history, and the last couple of days, yesterday and today, we've learned a lot about the arts and the sciences and how they can come together to provide certain solutions. If you don't mind me asking, I would love to know, if you think that your degree in history or your background in the arts has ever played a part in your career or your decision making. Love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, thanks, Darren. I appreciate that, and thanks, Louise, for pulling this together. I think this is a tremendous event for a lot of reasons. The principle among them is that it brings together so many diverse people from so many diverse backgrounds, and I think in regards to the question you asked about history, what that does, what history does, and what this event does is it provides, I believe, very important context in which for us to determine, if you will, or to be able to distinguish the problems that we're trying to solve from the problems that are not as important, or the problems that the things that we think are actually problems that may not be. And I think that, for example, in my current life in the Department of Defense, we spend a lot of time talking about the potential future strategies and things that we might do to address some of the problems and some of the challenges that face the country. And I've just noticed that the people that seem to have the deepest understanding of that are those that also have a deep understanding of the history and the context of how what came before the current crisis. In other words, that understand that the Earth didn't cool 2 years ago and that it's actually been around for a while, and understanding the cultures, if you will, of the various countries that we deal with. And we heard some of that this morning in the conversation or in the discussion about economics and about values and how people and cultures can have what appear to be very different values. And I just think that having a long view, if you will, of the history of a region, the history of us, of the West, and who we are and how we got to hold the values that we do today is hugely important. And I think, one of my own personal feelings is that people that wear the uniform of this country, especially when they ascend to the higher levels, are most effective when they have a much broader understanding of things that are outside of what you would consider to be, quote, just in the military realm, because you begin to deal more and more with issues of strategy and issues that affect the culture, if you will, of the various and sundry countries that we find ourselves involved with, and having a better understanding of what drives the decision process, what informs the morality of all of those countries, I think just makes you more effective at this, at the higher levels of government.
Thank you. Thank you. There was a discussion that we both attended on cybersecurity, and when we think about protecting our nation, we often think about cyber threats and technical abilities. Do you think that there are any other skills apart from technical in a cyberspace and in protecting our nation that are important, critical skills that you would look for in people or that you are thinking are important? There was another very, very interesting lecture here on neuroscience, for example, and we talked about behavior. Are they important things to consider?
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely the case. So to go back to the cyber piece for a minute, one of the things that it appears to me is, as you know, cyber is like the newest bright shiny object, if you will. It's the thing that everybody's kind of focused on right now. But the tendency can be to focus on the technology, and I think that somebody articulated that rather well this morning upstairs in the cybersecurity piece, that it's about more than just computer scientists. But I would suggest that the folks that are in the policy regime need to have a level of technical understanding that allows you to be able to put, if you will, in context the kinds of things that are happening on the web. So understanding exactly, quite frankly, how routers work, understanding how internet packets work, or packets on the internet, and how they get put together again, and what determines where they go and how they go is, I think, a very important part of as you try to fashion or try to get your head around some of the policy implications of cyber, what's the word I'm looking for, operations, things that are happening in that space. So I think that part of it is necessary. I think on the behavioral side, interestingly enough, I've been connected with some folks that are doing some work on trying to use some of the emerging insights in neuroscience to better understand some of the behavioral things that we're seeing in ISIL. And I don't know how much is actually going to come of all that, but I think that it's those kinds of interdisciplinary efforts that really are going to yield the greatest benefit. So if you take the biological sciences and neuroscience and you knit them together with the social sciences, if you will, like things like social psychology and some of the positioning theory and some of the emerging initiatives in that realm, that you may be able to get a better understanding of what it is that we're facing. And you know, it's we sometimes tend to jump to trying to solve a problem before we truly understand it. And I believe, I may not be exactly correct, but I believe it was Einstein that said, somebody asked him one day, what would you do if you had an hour, if you knew the world was going to end in an hour, what would you do? And he said, I'd spend the first 55 minutes trying to figure out what the problem was, and then try to go about solving it in the last 5 minutes. We tend to do just the opposite sometimes when we're faced with crises. We want to do things right away as opposed to thinking about them. And the skills of critical thinking and the ability to back away from a problem and not necessarily just to deconstruct the problem, but to do that in the context in which the problem exists, and to critically question the assumptions. So when you ask a question, so if somebody were to say to you, for instance, are we winning or losing this battle or that battle or whatever it is, the first question that would come to my mind is, so tell me what you mean by winning. Tell me what the metrics are. Tell me what that means. How do I know? What am I going to use to measure? First tell me what the end state looks like, and then tell me what kind of measurements I'm going to use to get there. And that kind of critical thinking skill is I think, just of eminent importance, if you will, in dealing with issues of dealing with any issues, but especially with issues that have to do with national security. So.
Sure. Now your access to threat intelligence goes far deeper than anything that we could ever experience.
I'm not going there.
But we hear a lot today about open source intelligence. Yeah. We hear a lot today about social media, and we hear things about the government relying on open source intelligence in order to better understand the threat landscape. How important is open source intelligence? How important is social media in your position?
So I think it's extremely important, to tell you the truth. I think a lot of, if you understand where a lot of the intelligence comes from, you begin to appreciate just how important it is to be able to understand what's in the open press. And in many cases, we learn a tremendous amount about what's going on in the open press. In terms of the social media, I mean, there are insights into behaviors of various organizations that are very evident on social media. There is a lot that occurs on Twitter. There's a lot that occurs in that space, and so I think that there actually is a lot to be had. Now, when you start talking about that kind of data, the thing that occurs to me is, how am I going to analyze that? You know, it's the same problem we have with big data in any endeavor, but you know, I've got to build algorithms that are going to parse out, if you will, and going to search out the kinds of things that I'm interested in. And then the challenge is, so let's say that I build a program like that, and it pulls all this real-time data off of Twitter, off of websites, off whatever it is. Well, now I've got to make sense of that, right? So I've got all this data, all these tweets, if you will, that are out there, and so now I've got to be able to put that into a context that's going to give me some insight into what either is happening right now, which would be one way of looking at it, but I think better yet, if we could develop the kind of analytic tools that would allow me to look at something like that and say that this is now going to give me some insight into the potentialities for future behavior. And then when I get to a level of sophistication that's even greater than that, it might begin to predict the kinds of emergent behavior that I might start to see in organizations. And so again, you know, you have a sort of a biological metaphor, if you will, that's very applicable, I think, to human organizations of any sort.
Sure, thank you. I think many of us are here because we're interested in hearing about future cyber threats and understand the threat landscape. Living in an unclassified world, are there any kind of articles or books that you might recommend in order to understand the capabilities of some of our adversaries?
I mean, you can actually learn a lot by reading the newspaper, quite frankly. You know, one of the things that questions I was asked a couple of months ago, I was at I guess it was last year, I went up to Harvard to speak at the John F. Kennedy School of Government up there, and they have this course in January where they do it's a compressed national security course, and I think it's 3 or 4 weeks long. And there was a gentleman named Richard Clark who'd written a book called Cyber War a couple of years ago when he was in the Bush White House, and it was about his postulation of how a lot of these things could occur. And he asked me to come up and speak to this seminar, and it was all unclassified, and it was supposed to be a seminar of about, God, I don't know, he said 15, maybe 20 people. So when I got up there, I walked in the room, and there was about 65 or 70 people standing in the room. And in the front row, there were 3 members of the Chinese delegation that were sitting there with tape recorders and pencils and pens. And I went, oh, this is going to be a beautiful afternoon. And so I kind of talked to him for a little bit, and he asked me a question. And the point I'm getting to, he said to me, do you think it's possible for us to have a useful and intelligent conversation about cyber capabilities without getting into the classification levels, the deeper classification levels? And actually, I was kind of taken back for a second, and I thought about it because, you know, there's a tendency to look at a lot of these things and say, well, you know, you don't know what you don't know, and if you knew what I knew or what somebody else knows, this would all be obvious to you. But I'm not so sure, to tell you the truth. And I think that, what the answer I gave him is, I said, you know, what I'm reminded of now is the cadre of nuclear policymakers that we in this country developed in the 50s and 60s. That were they were people that knew the technology behind nuclear weapons, but that thought deeply about the use of nuclear weapons. And it was not people in uniform; it was the civilians. And it was, and I said, you know, I think that that's something we should take a look at in the world of cyber. And I think that if you can, when you think about the kind of cyber things that are going on out there, if you can imagine something happening, if you can imagine that you can do this, it's probably the case that some point you will be able to do that if you can't today. But then to think about the implications of those kinds of things. And I take the point that somebody made this morning about the fact that this isn't warfare. I mean, I'm all over it. I mean, the word war, it's just like defining winning and losing, is a rather arbitrary decision. I mean, there's definitions of warfare, and then there's, but I think if you think in terms of conflict, and you begin to imagine, if you will, so let's just say, for example, that you were able to get into a power grid, okay? And they're called SCADA networks or ICS networks and control systems. And there's a system, a box, right, that controls all the electricity in this network. And if you could get into that box and start shutting power off to various and sundry things, so the question that I would ask is, okay, so what am I going to do that for? Why am I doing that? And oh, by the way, if you do that, chances are you're going to shut down power to all the hospitals in the city. Is that what you want to do? And so, but we need to have more of those conversations, I think, in the open. We need to have those kind of conversations about strategy, and that raising a cadre of folks that come out of programs like yours that have backgrounds in technical backgrounds in cyber that understand, I mean, it may not be programmers, but they understand how the internet works, and they understand the virtual and all the layers of that we talk about, but they also have a deep grounding in history and in strategy, and they're able to kind of see the way these two things come together. I mean, I think that would be a pretty useful thing for us to do. So in answer to your question, I'm not as compelled to keep this behind the green door. I mean, I do think that a lot of this can be talked about in the open, and should be, and it would allow us to have a richer conversation about the effects of the potential impacts of some of these capabilities.
Certainly, certainly. Recently, I was asked by a multinational financial to do an examination of mobile malware, and I thought this would be pretty straightforward, especially since if I don't know all the answers, I can reach out to some people I know who all they do is reverse engineer malware on a daily basis. And I was pretty shocked to find out that some of the top security companies in this country don't touch mobile malware at all. And people who reverse engineer malware on a daily basis have never touched anything to do with mobile. And so this became a really, really interesting project for me. What really stumped me, though, with this project is the idea of attribution. Yeah. So we were able to find lots of malware, and we could see some servers that they would link back to, but ultimately this whole notion of attribution is a very, very difficult one for me. And I'm just wondering, how does that complicate things for you? Is attribution a problem? And in the broader scheme of things, how's that going to affect policy? How's that going to affect decision making if we do enter a cyber war?
So one of the concepts that's getting a lot of play in Washington these days is they're calling it cyber deterrence. Okay, so the implication of that expression is that there is some form of deterrence that will work in the world of cyber. So in order to really speak intelligently about that, you'd have to unpack the meaning of the word deterrence, and you'd have to understand what that means in the general sense of trying to deter someone else's behavior, and the way that you deter that behavior is what is up for question. So, for example, classically, deterrence is put in an expression that sounds like this: that the credible capacity to coerce an enemy or to deter an enemy is in the eyes of the person we're trying to deter or trying to coerce. So you can imagine that our nuclear arsenal has no deterrence against ISIL. It hasn't so far, nor has it against anyone else, or anyone else that's not a nation state that has nuclear weapons. So as we think about attribution, one of the issues of deterrence is at least nuclear deterrence, and that's the similarity that people are trying to draw to cyber right now. And I think that there's some parts of that work, and maybe some that we need to think a little more deeply about. But as you look at attribution, a cyber attack of some sort becomes increasingly difficult to attribute to someone the more times it hops through various and sundry servers, some of which the people that own the servers and operate on them may not even know it's just gone through there. So, and then if you find that that you attribute that attack back to a box that originated in a country that was a friend, an ally, or an enemy. Now what are you going to do about it? Because the ability to attribute that directly is it is not as the easiest thing in the world to do. So I think that the concept of attribution, it has to be understood in the limitations of attribution in the larger context of deterrence theory, and how you would, for example, deter another nation state that was very interested in probing your networks and extracting data. And again, this morning we heard that in the discussion about this being, well, that's espionage. Okay, so what does that mean? I mean, I got that, so we've characterized it as espionage. So what does that mean we're going to do about it? Are we going to, or if anything, or is it just kind of the way the life is? So I take your point about attribution. It is a very large technical challenge, and at the end of the day, it's going to be presented to a decision maker with it's like everything else in life. There's very few things that are a slam dunk. It's always, well, sure, this is what we know and this is what we think, and somewhere in between the two of them is the answer. Right. So.
Glad to hear it's not just me who's having the problem. I think at this point I'd like to open it up to questions. If anybody.
Do you have anything they are interested in talking about? Last time I sat in front of the lights like this, 60 Minutes showed up in my office one morning. And, there's a standing joke in the Pentagon that, how do you know you're about ready to have the worst day in your life? It's when your staff tells you at 7:30, hey, 60 Minutes is on the phone, they want to talk to you. And yeah.
My name is Daniel Karpenshoff. Thank you very much for the very enlightening talk. An interesting aspect of the security threat online that we're sort of seeing emerge a couple of places is the ability to take online information offline and manifest that through 3D printing or engineering, what have you. So from a security threat perspective, how do you address the idea of distributing access keys, not just electronic keys, but like physical keys that you can print, or weapons, or munitions, what have you? A few days ago, it was discovered that the so-called 1620 key to New York City, which opens pretty much any public elevator and mass transit doors, can be downloaded and distributed and printed. How do you combat that? How do you address the idea that previous objects now flow freely from a security perspective?
So if I got the gist of what you were asking me, it was how do we address an issue where, to the point about the elevator piece, where there is things that are already in the system that we know about? Is that accurately what you're, can you?
Well, the tokens that is used to gain entry from previous completely isolated gateways, so the door of the record block, all of a sudden the access to that door, to that system, distributed completely free of any oversight whatsoever.
Okay, so let me see if I can get this. So the doors through which you gain the access to the system, that's where we started, right? So we have an access into a system. One of the things that I would suggest is that access is necessarily very frail, and it's very dependent on the way that network is organized, the way that network is architected. It may or may not be the same access 2 or 3 weeks from now or 2 or 3 days from now. If you suspect that something is inside of a network, even if you decide to air gap it so nothing else can get in there, you're still going to have to figure out how to get inside of that network and root out whatever is in there. Interestingly enough, some of the systems that we have that are air gapped are still very vulnerable to human intervention. Most of the security issues that we have and the networks that I deal with come from the operators of the network. They call it cyber hygiene. It's just basic the way you operate with the network, there is a responsibility on the operators of the network that I don't think that we sometimes fully account for, and we, in the way we operate on the net, and our responsibility to ensure that what we do is secure. So, did that answer your question? If not, I'll try it again.
Please.
If I can sneak in. I would just like to ask the question of, and we've heard certainly a lot of about cyber, but Bob, from your perspective, certainly there are a lot of threats today that we're confronted with: Syria, Iran, the host of the Middle East, refugee crisis, etc. But in 10 years' time, what do you think are the key threats to either American or global security from your perspective?
Wow. Well, so this morning we were having a conversation shortly after that meeting about the price of oil, right? And they were talking about how the price of oil has caused, is going to change, if you will, the dynamics in some of the nations that are in the Mideast. One of the things that occurs to me when we start talking about that is, so if we look down the road a couple of years, to your point, Matthew, and we get to the point where the United States and possibly other countries in the West are no longer reliant on the Mideast for oil, then how is that going to change the security dynamic of what is happening in the Mideast and our involvement there? So that is, I just think that that's something that we would be wise to take into account, because it appears to me that that's the direction that is heading. In terms of the other issues that we have, I don't see where the root of the issues that causes groups like ISIL to be ascendant, that until we address a lot of those root problems in there, I see that as being a continual issue. And one of the things that we think about when we think about that is how we view the world. Now, I'm not advocating this, but Henry Kissinger is one of the spokesmen for this realpolitik, and his and many others believe that stability is the most important part of what we do in terms of the interaction between nation states. So if that's the case, then the decision between then you could get into this, so what's worse? Is it worse to have a country that has a regime that we do not like, but that is stable, or to have a country, that same country with no regime, but that now becomes an ungoverned space that causes other things to occur? I think that we will deal with the rise with what's going on in the Far East. I think we're going to deal with that. We're going to deal with the as China becomes more and more influential in the Far East and begins to assume what they believe to be more of their rightful market share, if you will, that's going to have an effect on everybody else. After 20 years or so of peace breaking out, we find ourselves confronted with a resurgent Russia who has become very adept at using some of these cyber things we've been talking about this morning, in conjunction with many other things that have to do with information operations and have to do with military operations. And one only need look at their activities over the last few years to realize that is a hybrid threat, as some folks have called it, that you would have to sort of back up and think about. And I think that as we think about that, Matthew, one of the things that we ought to take a look at is, what do we view as our role in the world? We, the United States, we, the West. How do we think that we, ought to be seen, or that the way we ought to influence what's going on? And I think if we better understand that might give us a little more clarity in some of our strategies, and the extent to which we do those things together with allies, and the extent to which the United States does some of that alone is something that I think is better off thought through long before, and it goes way beyond the simplistic platitudes and about that we sometimes hear in the press about what our role in the world ought to be. So I don't know if that's much help, but I do think that the way to prepare the next generation of leaders and the generation that's dealing with those now for those kinds of issues is by encouraging them to take a longer view that is informed by a deeper understanding of the history and the context of the situations that they're dealing with.
Great, thank you.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have.
Okay, no problem.
Unfortunately, very short session.
No problem.
But thank you both so much.
Thank you.